My name is Claire Harper. I'm 39 years old, and I've spent most of my adult life chasing the truth behind myths and urban legends. I've made a career out of debunking the supernatural, turning ghost stories into explainable phenomena. Last Christmas Eve, I took my RV to Mammoth Cave National Park in Kentucky to investigate a legend about a haunted cave. I went there to expose another hoax. Instead, I found something I'll never be able to explain away. The trip started like any other. I parked my RV in a remote campsite near the edge of the forest, where the trailhead to the hollow began. It was a chilly day, with frost clinging to the undergrowth and a faint haze in the air. The trees stood like sentinels, their bare branches tangled against the gray sky. Perfect scenery for a ghost story. Before heading to the cave, I met Ruth Bell, a local historian who had agreed to give me some background for my article. Ruth was in her 60s, sharp-eyed and wary. She didn't hide her skepticism about my work. "You journalists think everything's a joke," she said, handing me a cup of steaming coffee as we sat on her porch. "But some things aren't meant to be poked at." "What exactly am I poking at?" I asked. Her eyes darkened. "The Hollow Witch. They say she was a healer, a midwife back in the 1800s. But the town turned on her, accused her of cursing their crops and livestock. They dragged her to the cave, bound her in iron chains, and left her to die." "And now her ghost haunts the hollow?" I prompted, trying to keep the skepticism out of my voice. "She doesn't just haunt it," Ruth said quietly. "She curses anyone who enters." I nodded politely, scribbling notes. I'd heard variations of this story a dozen times before. Still, there was something about Ruth's tone that unsettled me. "Thanks for your time," I said, standing to leave. "I'll be careful." Her hand shot out, gripping my wrist. "Promise me you won't go in. Stay away from the altar. If you disturb her, she won't let you leave." I laughed nervously. "I'll keep that in mind." I reached the hollow just before noon. The trail wound through a dense thicket of trees, the sunlight barely penetrating the canopy. It was silent, eerily so, with none of the usual sounds of the forest. Even the crunch of my boots on the frozen ground felt muffled. The cave itself was smaller than I'd expected, more like a gaping mouth than a grand cavern. Its entrance was overgrown with moss and brambles, and the air that wafted from within was damp and cold. I set up my camera and audio recorder, taking preliminary shots of the area. As I stepped closer, I noticed faint carvings etched into the stone around the entrance. Symbols I didn't recognize, worn smooth by time. They looked like protection sigils, though I wasn't an expert. I snapped a few pictures and ducked inside. The cave was darker than I'd anticipated, even with my flashlight. The walls were slick with moisture, and the air smelled of earth and decay. About 20 feet in, I found it. The altar Ruth had mentioned. It was a flat slab of rock, stained dark with something I didn't want to identify. Above it, rusted iron chains hung from the ceiling, their ends twisted into crude loops. My heart pounded, but not from fear. This was the kind of thing that sold articles, a tangible link to a chilling story. I took more photos, focusing on the chains and the strange symbols scratched into the altar's surface. That's when I heard it. A whisper, faint and indistinct, like wind through the trees. "Leave." I froze, the hair on my neck standing on end. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing off the walls. No response. Just the whisper, growing louder, angrier. "Leave." The air around me seemed to thicken, pressing against my chest. My flashlight flickered and the beam caught movement, a shadow darting across the wall. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The whisper rose to a shriek and I bolted. By the time I made it back to the RV, my hands were shaking. I told myself it was just my imagination, the natural eeriness of the cave playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I spent the afternoon reviewing my footage, but none of it made sense. The pictures I'd taken inside the cave were blurry, distorted, as if the camera had malfunctioned. The audio was worse, an incoherent mix of static and faint voices. At one point, I thought I heard my name. "Just a glitch," I muttered, though my voice lacked conviction. That night, the tapping started. It was faint at first, like a branch brushing against the RV, but there were no trees close enough to touch it. The taps grew louder, more deliberate, moving from one window to the next. I grabbed my flashlight and peered outside. Nothing. Just the dark forest and the empty trail. Then I saw them. Shadows moving between the trees, too quick and too silent to be human. My breath caught in my throat as one of them stopped and turned toward me. Its form was indistinct, but its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark. I stumbled back, locking the door and drawing the curtains. The tapping stopped, but the whispers began. By morning, I was ready to leave. I packed up my equipment and tried to start the RV, but the engine sputtered and died. I tried again. Nothing. "Come on, not now," I muttered, slamming the steering wheel. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. As I stepped outside to check the engine, I noticed footprints in the frost. Bare, human-like prints leading from the cave to the RV and back again. My stomach churned. I didn't remember seeing them the night before. Desperate, I hiked back to Ruth's house, my heart racing with every step. She opened the door before I could knock, as if she'd been waiting for me. "You went inside, didn't you?" she said, her voice flat. I nodded, too shaken to lie. "Something's following me. It wants something." She sighed heavily. "You disturbed her rest. She's marked you now." "What does that mean?" I demanded. "How do I stop it?" She hesitated, then handed me a small pouch of salt and a rusted horseshoe. "Salt and iron," she said. "Make a circle around your RV. Don't step outside it, and pray that's enough." That night, the witch came. I sat inside the RV, clutching the horseshoe as the salt circle glowed faintly in the moonlight. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, accompanied by the sound of scraping claws against metal. Then the shadow appeared. It stood just outside the circle, its form shifting and flickering like smoke. Its eyes burned red, and its voice filled the air, low and guttural. "You shouldn't have come," it said. "You took what was mine." "I didn't take anything," I whispered, my throat dry. The shadow leaned closer, its face inches from the circle. "Set me free." My hands trembled as I remembered the chain in the cave. Was that what it wanted? If I destroyed it, would it leave me alone? Or would it unleash something worse? The spirit slammed against the invisible barrier, and the RV shook violently. "Set me free!" it roared. I didn't sleep. As dawn broke, the shadow vanished, leaving behind only silence. I packed my things and fled, abandoning the RV in the woods. When I reached town, Ruth was waiting for me again. "You made it," she said, relief evident in her voice. "I didn't touch the chain," I said. "But she's still out there." "She always will be," Ruth replied. "It's her hollow." I didn't publish the article. I didn't even try. Some truths are better left untold, and some places are better left alone. My name is Daniel Harris, and I was 29 when I spent Christmas Eve alone in Pisa National Forest. I'm not someone you'd call an adventurer. I grew up in Charlotte, surrounded by the hum of city life, and my idea of wilderness was the overgrown lot behind our apartment complex. But last year, when my girlfriend left and the holidays loomed like a bad joke, I needed an escape. I told myself a winter camping trip would clear my head, give me purpose. Instead, it gave me something I'll never forget, and wish I could. It was late December when I packed my secondhand gear into my SUV and drove up to the Blue Ridge Mountains. The snow had fallen early that year, blanketing the forest in white. The roads were icy, and the sky was bruised with low clouds. But I felt a kind of reckless determination. Pisa was calling, and I had to answer. I planned to spend 2 nights, photograph the frozen trails, and return in time to toast a lonely glass of whiskey in my apartment on Christmas night. The gear I brought, I realize now, was laughably inadequate. A cheap nylon tent, a sleeping bag rated for fall weather, and a camp stove I hadn't tested. But I didn't care. I wanted isolation, and I found it. I set up camp on a ridge overlooking a shallow valley. The trees below bare skeletons in the snow. The first day went smoothly enough. I hiked, snapped pictures of icicles hanging like crystal daggers, and watched the sun sink behind the hills. But as night fell, the forest changed. It became something alive, restless. The kind of quiet that presses against your skull until you swear you can hear your own blood. That night, I woke up shivering. My sleeping bag, though zipped tightly around me, offered little warmth against the biting cold. The cheap tent flapped violently in the wind, and I could hear snow pattering against the fabric like tiny claws. I tried to sleep, but my teeth chattered too hard, and then I heard it. A whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it again, clearer this time, cutting through the gusts. Daniel. My name, spoken in a soft, sing-song voice that sent ice down my spine. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. Nothing. Just the wind sighing through the trees. Don't lose it, I muttered to myself, convincing myself it was a trick of my tired brain. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I found footprints in the snow. They circled my campsite, perfect impressions of bare feet, the toes splayed wide, almost human but not quite. My stomach tightened as I crouched to examine them. They weren't mine, and I was the only camper for miles. I wanted to pack up and leave, but pride kept me there. I refused to let a few eerie noises and footprints scare me off. I spent the day hiking deeper into the forest, photographing frost-covered ferns and the way the light broke through the snow-heavy branches. It was beautiful, but the beauty felt wrong, like a mask. Around mid-afternoon, the clouds darkened and the wind picked up. A storm was coming. I decided to head back, but that's when I saw it. The cabin. It stood a little off the trail, barely visible through the trees. The roof sagged under the weight of snow, and the windows were black, lifeless. I hadn't seen it on any map, but there it was, unmistakably real. Against my better judgment, I approached. The door creaked as I pushed it open. The inside was dark, the air stale and heavy. A rusted stove sat in one corner, and a wooden table stood in the center, its surface covered in dust. But what caught my eye were the photographs. Dozens of them, scattered across the table and pinned to the walls. They were old, sepia-toned, and they all featured the same man, a man who looked unsettlingly like me. I picked up one of the pictures and felt a chill. The man in the photo stood in a forest clearing, his face gaunt, his eyes wide and hollow. He wore clothes that could have been from the early 1900s, but the resemblance was uncanny. Beneath the photo was a scribbled note. He never left. I didn't linger. I ran back to camp, the snow falling harder now, my breath clouding in the icy air. By the time I reached my tent, the storm was in full swing and darkness had fallen. I huddled inside, trying to warm my hands with the sputtering stove, but my mind raced. Who was that man? Why did he look like me? That night, the whispers returned. Louder, insistent. They seemed to come from every direction at once, surrounding the tent. And then I heard something else. A low, guttural growl, followed by the sound of snow crunching underfoot. My heart seized. Something was out there. Grabbing my flashlight, I unzipped the tent just enough to peer outside. The beam of light cut through the snowstorm, illuminating the trees. At first, I saw nothing, but then it stepped into view. It was tall, its body gaunt and twisted, like a man stretched on a rack. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes glowed a sickly yellow. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The thing tilted its head and then it smiled, its mouth splitting wider than any human mouth should. I ducked back into the tent and zipped it shut, as if that thin layer of nylon could protect me. The whispers grew louder, the growl deeper, and then, in a voice that sounded eerily like mine, it spoke. "Daniel, come out." I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed with fear. At some point, the whispers faded and the growling stopped. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, waiting. At dawn, I decided to leave. Screw the photographs, screw the pride. My only goal was to get out alive. I packed my gear in a frenzy, my hands shaking so badly I could barely tie the straps. As I trudged through the snow, I heard footsteps behind me. Turning, I saw her. She was a woman, dressed in a ranger's uniform, her auburn hair tied back in a braid. She looked out of place, almost spectral, but her voice was steady. "You need to leave," she said. "No kidding," I stammered. "What the hell is out here?" Her eyes darkened. "It's a skinwalker. It knows you're afraid, and it'll use that fear to draw you in. You can't fight it, not in the way you think." "What do I do?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. She glanced over her shoulder, as if expecting the creature to appear at any moment. "Fire. It can't stand fire. But you'll have to trick it first, make it show itself fully. It won't be easy." And then, before I could ask more, she turned and walked into the woods, disappearing like a wisp of smoke. The creature found me again that night. I had built a small fire, its warmth doing little to calm my nerves. I sat clutching a makeshift torch, listening to the whispers grow closer. The thing stepped into the firelight, its twisted body casting long, spindly shadows. It spoke again, this time in the woman's voice. "Daniel, it's safe now. Come with me." "No," I said, my voice trembling but firm. "Show me what you really are." The creature paused, its head tilting in mock curiosity. Then, slowly, it stepped closer, its form shifting and contorting until it was fully visible in the firelight. Its skin bubbled and cracked, its limbs elongating unnaturally. Its smile widened, revealing rows of jagged teeth. I lunged forward and thrust the torch at it. The flames licked its pale skin, and it let out an unearthly scream. The sound was like nails on glass, piercing and unbearable. The creature stumbled back, its body writhing as the fire consumed it. The flames spread to the surrounding brush, and I ran, the forest behind me ablaze. When I finally reached the trailhead, exhausted and half frozen, I looked back. The fire had died down, and the forest was eerily quiet. I never saw the woman again, and when I asked the rangers about her, they had no record of anyone matching her description. The photographs I took on that trip? They were mostly ruined, overexposed from the heat of the fire. But one survived. It shows a figure standing just beyond the tree line, its yellow eyes glinting in the shadows. I keep it as a reminder to never go back. Pisa called to me once. It will never call again. My name is Ethan Wells. I'm 34, and this happened just last Christmas in Kisatchie National Forest, Louisiana. I'd planned to spend the holiday alone, parked in my old RV at the edge of the wilderness, with nothing but my sketchbook and the stillness of nature for company. It wasn't my first solo trip. I'd been chasing inspiration for months, hoping to rediscover the creative spark I'd lost. What I found instead was something far darker. I arrived at the forest mid-morning on Christmas Eve. The sky was overcast, the clouds heavy with the promise of rain. The ranger station was quiet when I pulled in to register my stay, and only one person was on duty, a woman named B. She looked to be in her mid-40s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense air that reminded me of my older sister. "You sure about camping out here alone?" B asked as she handed me a map. "Most people spend Christmas with family." I shrugged. "I like the quiet." She nodded, but didn't look convinced. "Just stick to the marked trails. And if you see any strange lights at night, don't follow them." I raised an eyebrow. "Strange lights?" She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping. "Locals call them the Devil's Lantern. They say it lures people off the path. Folks disappear, or worse." I chuckled, trying to hide my unease. "Let me guess. Campfire stories to keep tourists from wandering too far?" Her expression didn't change. "Suit yourself. But don't say I didn't warn you." I parked my RV at a secluded spot about a mile into the forest, near a trailhead that promised a scenic view of the cypress swamps. The place was perfect, quiet, remote, with only the occasional call of a bird to break the silence. I spent the afternoon sketching the gnarled trees and their ghostly drapes of Spanish moss, feeling for the first time in months that I might actually be onto something. As the sun set, a light drizzle began to fall, and I retreated to the RV. I made myself some instant ramen, flipped through the sketches, and listened to the rain pattering on the roof. It was peaceful, until I saw the light. At first, I thought it was a flashlight. It flickered just beyond the trees, pale and faint, like someone walking the trail, but then it moved. Too fast, too smoothly to be a person. It darted between the trunks, circling my campsite before vanishing altogether. I told myself it was just fireflies, or maybe my eyes playing tricks on me after hours of staring at my sketches. I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and went to bed. The next morning, I decided to explore deeper into the forest. The rain had stopped, leaving the ground soft and muddy, and the air smelled of damp earth. I followed the trail for about a mile before I came across a ramshackle cabin tucked between the trees. It looked abandoned, its roof sagged, and the windows were boarded up, but smoke curled faintly from a crooked chimney. "Lost, are you?" A voice called from the shadows of the porch. I froze. A man stepped into view, his clothes tattered and his face lined with age and dirt. He looked like he belonged to the forest itself, as much a part of the landscape as the trees. "Not lost," I said, forcing a smile. "Just passing through." The man nodded, his eyes narrowing as he studied me. "You parked that RV near the trailhead?" "Yeah, why?" "You see it yet, the lantern?" I hesitated. "You mean the light? I thought it was fireflies." He chuckled, low and humorless. "Ain't no fireflies, boy. That's the Devil's Lantern. It sees you now." "What do you mean, it sees me?" The man stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It's a spirit. Feeds on the lonely, the lost. Once you see it, it won't let go. Best you leave now, while you still can." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded and walked away, his words echoing in my head. That night, the lights returned. This time, there were two of them, flickering in unison just beyond the RV's windows. They hovered there, bobbing like lanterns in a breeze, casting faint, ghostly shadows on the trees. I tried to ignore them, focusing on my sketches, but the lines on the page twisted under my pencil, forming shapes I hadn't intended. Distorted faces, hollow eyes, mouths open in silent screams. The lights began to move, circling the RV faster and faster until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. And then, faintly, I heard it. A whisper. My name, spoken in a voice I didn't recognize but couldn't help but trust. "Ethan, come outside." I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay seated. "You're not real," I muttered. "This isn't happening." But the whispers continued, growing louder, more insistent. And then, just as suddenly as they'd started, they stopped. The lights vanished, and the forest fell silent. I didn't sleep that night. By Christmas morning, I was running on caffeine and nerves. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming when I arrived, now felt oppressive. Every shadow hiding something unseen. I decided to pack up and leave, but when I tried to start the RV, the engine sputtered and died. "Great," I muttered, slamming the dashboard. "Just great." I stepped outside to check the engine, and that's when I saw them. Footprints in the mud, leading from the trees to my RV and back again. They weren't mine, they weren't anyone's. The prints were impossibly large, with long, claw-like toes that made my skin crawl. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. Desperation drove me back to the cabin. Henry, the hermit, was there, sitting on the porch as if he'd been waiting for me. "It's still here," I said, my voice shaking. "The lantern. It's following me." He nodded. "Told you, it sees you." "Then how do I stop it? How do I make it go away?" Henry leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "You can't, but you can keep it out. Salt, iron, things it can't cross. Make yourself a circle. Stay inside it till dawn. And if I don't..." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. I followed his advice, spreading a circle of salt around the RV and placing a handful of nails by each window. The lights came back that night, brighter than ever, their whispers louder, angrier. "Ethan, let us in!" They circled the RV, testing the salt, their voices rising to a cacophony of demands and accusations. They called me a coward, a failure, a fraud. They promised to show me things I'd lost, people, memories, dreams, if I'd only step outside. I nearly did. The temptation was unbearable, the pull of the lights almost physical. But I forced myself to stay inside the circle, clutching a rusted nail like a lifeline. When dawn broke, the lights vanished, leaving behind only silence. I packed up what little I could carry and hiked to the ranger station, leaving the RV behind. Bea was there, waiting, her expression grim. "You saw them, didn't you?" she asked. I nodded, too tired to lie. She didn't press for details. She just handed me a mug of coffee and a map to the nearest town. "Next time," she said, "maybe spend Christmas with people who care about you." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. To this day, I don't know what the lanterns were or why they chose me, but one thing's for sure, I'll never go back to Kisatchie National Forest. Some things are better left unseen. My name is Dylan, and I was 27 when this happened. It was Christmas week, 2021, and instead of cozying up by the fire with my family or binge-watching holiday movies, I convinced my sister Jenna, my best friend Sam, and his girlfriend Mia to spend the holidays camping in Oak Creek Canyon, Arizona. It was supposed to be an adventure, something to break the monotony of the season. What we found there broke us instead. We drove up in my old Jeep, the trunk packed with camping gear I'd snagged from a thrift store. Jenna, 28, who was always the practical one, kept asking me if I'd tested the equipment beforehand. It's fine, I said, brushing her off. We'll rough it a little. That's part of the fun. Sam, 26, wasn't as enthusiastic. Dylan, if we freeze our asses off, I'm blaming you. Mia, 25, was the only one who seemed genuinely excited. She was a budding photographer and had been reading up on the local legends of Oak Creek Canyon. Did you know people around here talk about strange creatures in the woods? She said, flipping through an article on her phone as we drove. Like Bigfoot? I joked. No, more like skinwalkers, she replied, her voice dropping a little. Shapeshifters, Navajo legend. They can take the form of animals, or even people, to cause chaos and harm. Great, Jenna muttered from the back seat. Nothing like a cursed Christmas. By the time we reached the canyon, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the snow-dusted trees. We found a secluded spot off a lesser-used trail and set up camp. The thrift store tent turned out to be missing a pole, and one of the sleeping bags had a busted zipper, much to Sam's annoyance. I laughed it off, but Jenna's glare made me keep my mouth shut. The first night was cold, bitterly cold. The wind howled through the canyon like a living thing, and the campfire barely kept us warm. Mia snapped pictures of the trees and the stars, while Sam grumbled about my bargain basement gear. It was around midnight when I first noticed something strange. The forest had gone silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant calls of nocturnal animals. Just nothing. "Do you hear that?" I asked, breaking the quiet. "Hear what?" Sam replied. "Exactly. There's nothing." Jenna frowned. "That's normal, right? Maybe the animals are just sleeping." But they weren't. Animals don't stop moving altogether, not like that. I didn't say anything more, but a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. The next day, we hiked deeper into the canyon. The snow was thicker here, blanketing the world in white. Mia pointed out tracks in the snow, huge, clawed prints that looked like they belonged to a bear. But a few steps later, the prints changed, becoming more human-like. "That's not normal," Jenna said, her voice tight. "Probably just melted weird," I said, though I didn't believe it myself. Mia snapped a picture. "Weird or not, this is going in my portfolio." The rest of the day was uneventful, but that night, things got worse. It started with the voices. We were sitting around the campfire when we heard them. Soft, distant, but unmistakable. Someone calling my name. "Dylan." It was faint, almost like the wind, but it was there. "Did you hear that?" I asked, looking around. Sam shook his head. "Hear what?" "Someone called my name." "You're imagining things," Jenna said, though she sounded uneasy. But then it happened again. "Dylan, help me!" This time, everyone heard it. Mia's face went pale, and Jenna grabbed my arm. "It's probably just the wind," Sam said, though his voice was shaky. The voices continued throughout the night, calling each of our names in turn. They sounded familiar but distorted, like a recording played on a warped tape. None of us slept. By the third day, tensions were running high. Sam and I got into an argument over the map, which he claimed I was reading wrong. Jenna snapped at both of us for being careless, and Mia kept looking over her shoulder like she expected something to jump out at her. It was Mia who found the clearing. We'd wandered off the trail, trying to find a shortcut back to camp, when she stopped dead in her tracks. "Guys, look." Ahead of us was a circle of trees, their trunks stripped bare and carved with strange symbols. In the center of the clearing was a pile of bones. Animal, human, I couldn't tell, and hanging from the branches were talismans made of feathers, twine, and bits of fur. "What the hell is this?" Jenna whispered. "Probably just some hunter's camp," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. No hunter made this, Mia said, snapping a photo. We need to leave, Jenna said firmly. Now! But as we turned to go, the forest came alive with movement. Shadows flickered between the trees, too fast to follow. We heard growls, low and guttural, followed by a chilling, almost human laugh. We ran. By the time we got back to camp, Jenna was furious. This is your fault, Dylan. You and your stupid idea to come out here with half-broken gear and no plan. Hey, how was I supposed to know this place was haunted? I shot back. It's not haunted, Sam said, though he sounded like he was trying to convince himself. There's a rational explanation for all of this, but no amount of rationality could explain what happened next. That night, Jenna disappeared. We woke up to find her sleeping bag empty, her boots and coat gone. At first we thought she'd gone to the creek, but her tracks led into the woods and stopped abruptly. "Jenna!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the canyon. No answer. We searched for hours, but there was no sign of her. The only thing we found was her jacket, neatly folded and placed on a rock by the creek. The real horror began that evening. As the sun set, we heard Jenna's voice. "Dylan! Sam, help me!" It was coming from the woods, but it didn't sound quite right. The pitch was off, the tone flat, like someone trying to mimic her but not quite getting it right. "It's not her," Mia said, her voice trembling. "It's the skinwalker." "That's ridiculous," Sam said, though he didn't move toward the sound. "It's real," Mia insisted. "I read about this. Skinwalkers prey on fear and chaos. We have to stay calm and stick together." But we didn't. I was the first to break. I couldn't just stand there while something, or someone, used my sister's voice to lure us out. I grabbed the flashlight and ran into the woods, ignoring Mia's protests. I didn't get far. The trees closed in around me, and the shadows seemed to move. I heard Jenna's voice again, closer now. "Dylan, help me!" I followed the sound to a clearing, where I found the same symbols carved into the trees. In the center was a figure, tall, gaunt, and impossibly twisted. It had Jenna's face, but her eyes were black pits, and her mouth stretched too wide in a grotesque smile. "Dylan," it said, its voice a hollow echo. "Come closer." I froze. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Back at camp, Mia and Sam were huddled by the fire, clutching sticks they'd lit as makeshift torches. The figure followed me back, circling the campsite just beyond the firelight. "We need to make a protective circle," Mia said. She grabbed the ash from the fire and scattered it in a ring around us. "Stay inside no matter what." The creature circled us, its form shifting between animals: wolf, coyote, deer, and human. It called our names, pleaded for us to come out. "Dylan," it whispered. "It's me, Jenna. Don't you want to save me?" I almost stepped out, but Mia grabbed my arm. "It's lying." The night stretched on endlessly, the creature's taunts growing louder and more desperate. Finally, just before dawn, it let out a piercing scream and disappeared into the trees. We didn't wait to see if it would come back. As soon as the sun rose, we packed up and left. We never found Jenna. All that was left of her was her folded jacket and the memories of her laughter, now twisted into something horrifying. To this day, I don't know what I saw in those woods, but I'll never go back. My name is Rachel Torres, and I was 29 when I decided to spend Christmas week in the Daniel Boone National Forest in Kentucky. I know, it's not exactly the most festive choice, but I'm a travel vlogger, and I wanted to do something different for my channel. My audience loves eerie, off-the-beaten-path places, and Devil's Hollow was perfect, remote, mysterious, and steeped in chilling folklore. It was supposed to be just another video, a way to boost my following. I had no idea what I was walking into. I parked my RV at the edge of the hollow on December 23rd under a leaden sky that threatened snow. The air was biting cold, and the forest seemed unnaturally quiet, like it was holding its breath. The trees were gnarled, their branches clawing at the sky, and a thin layer of frost coated the ground. It was the kind of place that made you feel small, like you didn't belong. On my way to the campsite, I stopped at a gas station to pick up some supplies. The cashier, a chatty man in his early 40s named Noah, noticed my gear and asked where I was headed. "Devil's Hollow," I said, watching his face carefully. He froze, his hand hovering over the register. "You sure about that?" "It's for a video," I said, shrugging. "People love creepy stories." "Well, you'll get plenty of that there," he said, his voice low. "Place is cursed, if you believe the old tales." I raised an eyebrow. "What kind of tales?" He leaned in, glancing around as if someone might overhear. "Back in the 1800s, there was a preacher who settled there with his congregation. Folks say he wasn't right in the head, claimed he spoke to God, but his sermons were full of fire and blood. Rumor has it he started sacrificing people, his own flock, until the townsfolk burned his church to the ground. They say his spirit's still out there, wandering the hollow, looking for souls to claim." It was a good story, perfect for my video. "Thanks for the warning," I said, smiling, "but I'm not worried about ghosts." He didn't smile back. "Just don't stay too long, and whatever you do, don't follow the lights." The first day passed uneventfully. I filmed shots of the forest, the twisted trees, and the creek that wound its way through the hollow. It was beautiful in a stark, forbidding way. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature plummeted, and the forest grew darker than I expected, the trees blotting out the sky. That night, as I sat editing footage in the RV, I noticed something odd. In one of the shots, a shadow moved in the background, just at the edge of the frame. It was subtle, easy to dismiss as a trick of the light, but it nagged at me. Around midnight I heard it, a low humming, faint at first but growing louder. It sounded human, like someone singing without words. My stomach tightened as I peered out the window, but the forest was empty. Just wind, I told myself, nothing to worry about. But when I went to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I decided to explore more of the hollow. I found an old trail leading deeper into the woods, marked by symbols carved into the trees. They looked like a mix of crosses and pentagrams, their meaning unclear. I filmed everything, narrating for my audience. "This area has a dark history," I said, keeping my tone casual. "Some say these carvings were left by the preacher's followers. Others think they're warnings to stay away." As I walked, I noticed footprints in the snow. They were fresh, leading toward the creek, but there were no return tracks. I followed them for a while, but they vanished abruptly, as if the person had been plucked from the earth. That night, the humming returned, louder and more insistent. It seemed to come from the creek, a haunting melody that sent chills down my spine. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my camera and ventured outside. The cold bit into my skin as I followed the sound, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. When I reached the creek, the humming stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence. I scanned the area, my breath clouding in the frigid air. That's when I saw it. A lantern, old and rusted, hanging from a low branch. It swayed gently, though there was no wind. My heart pounded as I approached, my camera rolling. I reached out to touch it, but a voice, low and guttural, whispered my name. I bolted back to the RV, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands trembled as I replayed the footage. The lantern was there, clear as day, but the whisper wasn't. It was as if the sound had been meant only for me. The next morning, I was ready to leave. Whatever content I had was enough. I didn't need more. But when I tried to start the RV, the engine sputtered and died. I tried again and again, but it wouldn't turn over. Panic bubbled in my chest. I was alone, miles from the nearest road with no cell service and no way out. The forest felt alive around me, the trees pressing closer. I stepped outside, hoping to find a solution, and froze. The lantern from the creek was hanging on the RV door, swinging slightly. My stomach churned as I realized it couldn't have been there by accident. That's when I saw him. At the edge of the forest stood a figure tall and gaunt, with a shadowed face and a tattered coat. He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't look away. Finally, he raised a hand, pointing toward the creek. The gesture was slow, deliberate, and filled with menace. Desperate, I remembered Noah's story about the preacher. If the townsfolk had destroyed his church, maybe fire could weaken him. I grabbed a lighter from my pack and ran to the clearing where the lantern had first appeared. The chanting began as soon as I arrived, a low, rhythmic sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The figure appeared again, closer this time, his face still hidden in shadow. He was muttering, his words unintelligible but filled with malice. I lit the lantern and threw it into the snow. The flames caught, brighter than they should have been, spreading quickly. The figure let out a guttural scream, his form flickering like a dying flame. The chanting stopped and the air grew still. The RV started on the first try. I didn't look back as I drove away, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. When I reached the highway, I let out a shaky breath, relief washing over me. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw it. A faint, charred handprint on the back window. I don't know if I escaped him entirely. I'm not sure I ever will. My name is Ben Travers, and I was 34 when I spent Christmas week in Zion National Park. At the time, I was searching for something. Peace, maybe, or a new direction. I'd left my job in Chicago a month earlier, burned out from years of corporate grind. Instead of jumping straight into the next big thing, I decided to take some time to reconnect with myself. A solo RV trip through the Southwest seemed like the perfect escape. That's how I found myself driving into Kolob Canyons, the quieter, lesser visited section of the park. The towering red cliffs and deep silence felt both humbling and eerie. The cold, crisp air cut through the midday sun as I parked my RV at a remote site near a winding creek. There were no other campers around, exactly what I wanted. The first night was uneventful. I cooked dinner, read a book by the dim glow of a lantern, and fell asleep to the soothing sound of the creek flowing nearby. It wasn't until the second day that things started to feel off. It began with the footsteps. That morning, I hiked a trail near the campsite, marveling at the cliffs towering above me. The landscape was surreal, almost alien, painted in shades of red and gold. As I made my way back to the RV, I heard footsteps crunching in the snow behind me. I stopped and turned, expecting to see another hiker, but no one was there. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing off the cliffs. Nothing, just the wind rustling through the pines. I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was an echo of my own steps, and continued walking. But the feeling of being watched lingered, prickling the back of my neck. When I reached the RV, I noticed something strange. The snow around the vehicle was undisturbed except for my own tracks. No sign of anyone else having been there. But on the windows, faint handprints had formed in the frost. Small, childlike handprints. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Probably just condensation, I muttered, trying to calm myself, but deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. Later that afternoon, I stopped by the visitor's center to check the weather report and grab a map. The ranger on duty, a grizzled man named Dave, greeted me with a polite nod. "Cold night ahead," he said. "Hope you're staying warm out there." "Trying to," I replied. "I'm camping by the creek." Dave's expression darkened slightly. "Kolob Creek? That's a remote spot. Beautiful, but you might want to be careful." "Careful?" I asked. "Why?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "Locals tell stories about that area. Old Paiute legend about a shaman who cursed the land after settlers desecrated sacred ground. Some folks swear they've seen things. Figures, lights, shadows. You know how people are." I forced a laugh. "Sounds like campfire tales." "Maybe," he said, but his tone suggested otherwise. "Just don't wander too close to the creek at night." I thanked him for the advice and headed out, but his words stayed with me. That evening, I settled in with dinner and a journal, trying to capture my thoughts about the trip. As the sun dipped below the cliffs, the landscape turned a deep crimson, and the shadows lengthened. The sense of isolation that had been so appealing suddenly felt oppressive. I was just starting to doze off when I heard it, the sound of footsteps again, this time circling the RV. My heart pounded as I grabbed a flashlight and peered out the window. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but snow and trees. "Hello!" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. But then I heard a faint whisper, like wind passing through the canyon, though it seemed to carry words I couldn't understand. I locked the RV door and sat down, trying to steady my breathing. The next morning, I ran into a woman named Janet at a trailhead. She was around my age, friendly but cautious, with a weathered backpack slung over one shoulder. "You're camping out here solo?" she asked after we exchanged greetings. "Yeah," I said. "It's been quiet." She gave me a knowing look. "Too quiet, huh? I stayed near Kolob Creek once, never again." "What do you mean?" I asked, curious. "Something about that area doesn't feel right," she said. "The Paiutes considered it sacred, and there are stories about people disturbing the land and paying for it. Handprints on windows, voices in the night, that kind of thing." My stomach dropped. "You've seen the handprints?" She nodded. "They say it's the shaman's spirit, drawn to grief and loneliness. Be careful. Respect the land." I thanked her, feeling a chill despite the morning sun. Janet's words echoed in my mind as I returned to the RV. That night, the unease escalated. I woke to the acrid smell of smoke, even though I hadn't lit a fire. Disoriented, I stumbled out of bed and opened the door. The air was clear, but the smell lingered, faint and choking. And then I saw it. A figure by the creek, silhouetted against the moonlight. It was humanoid but unnaturally tall, its limbs elongated and its movements jerky, almost insect-like. It didn't approach me but seemed to beckon, raising one hand slowly. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. Finally, I forced myself to retreat into the RV, locking the door and drawing the curtains. For hours, I sat there, listening to the whispers outside until exhaustion overtook me. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I packed up my gear, ready to leave, but the RV wouldn't start. The engine sputtered, then died. Frustrated and panicked, I tried again and again, but it was no use. That's when Janet appeared, her breath visible in the freezing air. "You're still here?" she asked, surprised. I tried to leave, I said, my voice shaking. The RV won't start. Something's wrong. She looked past me toward the creek, her expression grim. It's the spirit. You need to make things right. What does that mean? I asked, exasperated. She hesitated, then pointed to a small pile of rocks near the creek. That's a cairn. It marked sacred ground, but it's been disturbed. If we rebuild it, maybe it'll calm the spirit. Together, we approached the cairn. The air grew colder with every step, and the whispers grew louder, almost intelligible. Janet and I worked quickly, stacking the rocks into a balanced tower. As we worked, the shadows around us seemed to shift, taking on distorted humanoid shapes. Suddenly, a gust of wind knocked Janet off her feet, sending the rocks scattering. The spirit appeared again, closer this time, its dark form pulsating with rage. It didn't attack, but loomed over us, its presence suffocating. "Finish it!" Janet gasped, clutching her side. I scrambled to rebuild the cairn, my hands trembling. As a final gesture, I placed a small compass, a keepsake from my late mother, on top as an offering. The wind stopped abruptly, and the spirit began to dissolve, its form dissipating into the air. "You've shown respect," a voice whispered, faint and distant. "But remember..." The RV started without issue that time. Janet and I parted ways, and I drove out of the canyon as the first light of dawn illuminated the cliffs. But as I reached the highway, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a faint handprint on the window. Some things, I realized, are never truly left behind. My name is Ellie Moore. I'm 26 and I'm a wildlife photographer. Last Christmas, I decided to take my RV to Kisatchie National Forest in Louisiana, thinking I'd spend the holidays alone in nature, doing what I love. It was supposed to be peaceful, just me, my camera, and the beauty of the wilderness. But what I found in Whispering Hollow was anything but peaceful. It was something I'll never forget, something I'll never escape. I arrived at Kisatchie on the morning of Christmas Eve. The forest was quiet, wrapped in a thin veil of fog, the kind that makes everything feel just a little too still. I parked my RV near a clearing and spent the afternoon hiking and scouting locations. Whispering Hollow, the area I wanted to explore, was tucked deep within the forest, surrounded by legends of ghostly children and unexplained disappearances. It was exactly the kind of eerie, atmospheric setting I was looking for to capture something truly unique. By the time I returned to the RV, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. I locked up for the night, made myself a quick dinner, and reviewed the photos I'd taken. They were good, some of the best I'd shot in months, but something felt off. A few frames had strange blurs, as if something had moved too fast for my lens to capture. I told myself it was nothing. Probably just a trick of the light. The first sign of trouble came that night. I was lying in bed half asleep when I heard it. Faint giggles outside the RV. Children's laughter, high-pitched and distant, carried on the wind. My eyes snapped open and my heart began to race. I told myself it was just my imagination, maybe an animal or the wind, but the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, closer, until it seemed to circle the RV. I grabbed my flashlight and peered out the window, but the clearing was empty. Still, the laughter continued, faint and haunting, until it faded into the night. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I stepped outside to find tiny handprints on the RV's windows. They were faint but unmistakable, as if a group of children had pressed their palms against the glass. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe some local kids had wandered through the clearing while I slept. That had to be it. I packed my gear and headed deeper into the forest, determined to find Whispering Hollow. The trail grew narrower, the trees denser, until the sunlight barely reached the ground. The air was damp and cold, and the fog thickened with every step. After what felt like hours, I stumbled upon an old clearing marked by a crumbling wooden sign, Whispering Hollow. The place was hauntingly beautiful. Moss-covered trees arched over the clearing like a cathedral, and the ground was littered with decaying remnants of the past. Rusted tools, broken toys, and what looked like the frame of an old wagon. I felt a chill run down my spine, but dismissed it as excitement. This was exactly the kind of shot I'd been hoping for. As I began snapping photos, I noticed movement in the corner of my eye, a flash of white darting between the trees. I lowered my camera, scanning the forest, but saw nothing. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, so soft I could barely make it out. My name. Ellie! My breath caught. The whisper was followed by a giggle, then another flash of movement. A small figure darted behind a tree, a child, pale and barefoot, dressed in tattered, old-fashioned clothes. My rational mind told me it was impossible, but my feet moved on their own, carrying me toward the figure. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The child didn't respond. Instead, it turned and ran deeper into the forest. Against my better judgment, I followed. The trees closed in around me, their gnarled branches twisting like claws. The fog grew thicker, muffling every sound except for the faint laughter that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I tried to turn back, but the trail had vanished, swallowed by the mist. Panic bubbled in my chest. "Ellie!" The whisper came again, closer this time. I spun around, and there they were. A group of pale, silent children standing just a few feet away. Their faces were expressionless, their eyes dark and empty. They stared at me, unblinking, as if waiting for something. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The children didn't answer. Instead, they raised their hands, pointing to a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the clearing. The keeper. It was tall, impossibly tall, with a face obscured by darkness and eyes that glowed like embers. Its presence was suffocating, a wave of dread that pinned me in place. The keeper stepped forward, its movement slow and deliberate, and the children began to circle me, their small hands reaching out as if to pull me closer. "You've come far," the keeper said, its voice deep and resonant, echoing in my mind. "Drawn by guilt, by grief. You belong here, Ellie." "No," I stammered, taking a step back. "I don't belong here." The keeper laughed, a low, guttural sound. "Oh, but you do. Your guilt brought you to me, your pain. Let me take it from you." I realized then what it wanted. Not just me, but my grief, my sadness, the pain I'd carried since losing my younger brother in a car accident 2 years ago. It was feeding on my vulnerability, using it to trap me just as it had trapped the children. "Let me go," I said, my voice trembling. The keeper stepped closer, its shadow engulfing me. "You're already mine." Desperation took over. I reached for my camera, raising it to the keeper's face, and snapped a photo. The flash lit up the clearing, and the keeper recoiled, its form flickering like a glitching image. The children froze, their empty eyes wide with confusion. I didn't wait. I turned and ran, the sound of footsteps, hundreds of footsteps, chasing me through the fog. My lungs burned, my legs screamed. But I didn't stop until I burst out of the forest and into the clearing where my RV was parked. As I fumbled with the keys, a figure emerged from the trees. It was Ray, the old man I'd met earlier, holding a flaming torch. He didn't say a word, just waved the torch toward the forest, shouting something in a language I didn't understand. The footsteps stopped, and the forest fell silent. "Get in," he growled, his voice rough but steady. And don't look back. I don't remember much of the drive back to civilization. Ray followed me in his truck, making sure I didn't stop until we were miles away from Whispering Hollow. When I finally pulled over, he leaned out of his window and said, "They let you go this time. Don't give them a reason to call you back." I wanted to ask him what he meant, but he drove off before I could say a word. It's been a year since that night, and I still don't have an explanation for what happened. I never shared the photos I took in Whispering Hollow. Most of them came out blank anyway, except for one. A single shot of the keeper, its glowing eyes staring directly at the camera. Sometimes, late at night, I hear faint giggles outside my window. And sometimes, I swear I can see tiny handprints on the glass. My name is Marcus Grant. I'm 35, a former park ranger turned freelance writer, and I consider myself a skeptic when it comes to the supernatural. At least, I used to. Last Christmas, I took my RV out to the Pinaleno Mountains in Arizona to research a story about an abandoned mining town called Burro Flats. I'd heard rumors of curses and demonic legends surrounding the place, and I thought it'd make for an interesting article. But what I found there, well, let's just say I'm not the same man who set out that day. I left Tucson early on Christmas Eve, determined to reach the base of Mount Graham before nightfall. My RV was stocked with supplies, a week's worth of food, a stack of notebooks, and a sturdy flashlight. The drive was peaceful enough, the desert landscape painted white with a rare dusting of snow. It wasn't until I stopped at a small diner in the foothills that I got my first warning. The place was nearly empty, save for a waitress and a woman in her 30s with dark, curly hair and a piercing gaze. She introduced herself as Danny Morales, a local historian who'd heard about Burro Flats. When I told her I was heading there, she leaned forward, her voice low and serious. "You're messing with things you don't understand," she said. "Burro Flats isn't just cursed, it's a scar. People disappear out there, and the ones who come back aren't the same." I smiled politely, brushing her off, but her words stayed with me. She told me about the devil's footsteps, hoof-shaped burns that appeared in the snow near the abandoned mine. "Whatever's out there," she said, "it doesn't want visitors." I thanked her and left, chalking her warning up to local superstition. But by the time I reached the trailhead, the sun was sinking, and a sense of unease had begun to creep over me. The first thing I noticed as I hiked towards Burro Flats was the stillness. The forest was unnervingly quiet. The usual chatter of birds and rustling leaves replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. Snow fell in soft flakes, muffling my footsteps, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than I'd like to admit. About halfway to the town, I saw him, a man sitting on a fallen log by the side of the trail. He was dressed in a tattered coat, his boots caked with mud and snow. His face was pale, almost waxy, and he smiled at me in a way that made my skin crawl. "Cold day for a hike," he said, his voice smooth and calm. Could say the same for you," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. He chuckled, a low, unsettling sound. "You're heading to the mine, aren't you? Folks always do." I frowned. "How do you know that?" He didn't answer. Instead, he leaned forward, his eyes glinting in the fading light. "Sometimes, the devil doesn't take what he's owed. He waits for you to give it willingly." Before I could respond, he stood and walked off into the trees, vanishing into the shadows. I told myself he was just a drifter, harmless, if a little strange. But as I continued towards Burro Flats, the weight of his words settled on my shoulders like a shroud. I reached the town just as the last rays of sunlight disappeared. Burro Flats was exactly what I'd expected. a collection of crumbling buildings huddled around the entrance to an old mine. Snow blanketed the ground, but something about the place felt wrong. The air was heavy, almost electric, and a faint red glow seeped from the mine's mouth, casting long shadows across the snow. I set up my camera, snapping photos of the decaying structures. The buildings were riddled with claw marks, as if some wild animal had torn at the wood. Strange symbols were carved into the door frames, circles, triangles, and jagged lines I couldn't decipher. As I explored, I noticed hoof-shaped burns in the snow near the mine. They were impossibly precise, each one smoldering faintly, as if something had seared them into the ground. My breath caught, but I forced myself to move closer. The first sign of trouble came when I stepped into the saloon. The air was colder inside, biting and sharp, and the floorboards groaned beneath my boots. As I scanned the room, I heard it. Faint singing, like an old mining chant echoing through the building. My pulse quickened, but I couldn't see anyone. I followed the sound to the back of the saloon, where I found a single chair with a rope tied to its armrests. The rope was frayed, as if someone, or something, had struggled against it. My hands shook as I took a photo, the flash illuminating the room for a split second. That's when I saw them. Shadowy figures moving in the corners, their faces obscured, but their eyes glowing faintly red. I stumbled out of the saloon, my heart pounding. The chanting continued, growing louder, and when I turned toward the mine, I saw him, the drifter, standing at the entrance. He smiled that same unsettling smile and beckoned me forward. Against my better judgment, I approached the mine. The red glow inside was stronger now, pulsing like a heartbeat. As I stepped closer, the air grew thick, the smell of sulfur burning my nose. The walls seemed to shimmer, and when I shone my flashlight, I saw words scratched into the stone. Marcus Grant, welcome. My legs nearly gave out. How did it know my name? The whispers began then, soft and insistent, offering promises of wealth, power, and answers to questions I hadn't even asked. You can take it, the drifter said, appearing beside me. The mine will give you anything you desire. All it asks is a small sacrifice. What kind of sacrifice? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. He grinned, his teeth unnaturally sharp. Your soul, but don't worry, it's not as painful as they say. I turned and ran, the whispers chasing me, growing louder and more frantic. The snowstorm had intensified, burying my footprints and obscuring the path back to my RV. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees twisting and shifting like living things. The sound of hooves echoed behind me, impossibly fast, and when I glanced back, I saw them. Shadowy figures with glowing eyes, their clawed hands reaching for me. The drifter was among them. His smile wider now, his movement smooth and predatory. I tripped, falling hard into the snow. My flashlight skittered away, and for a moment, I thought it was over. But then I remembered Danny's warning. The devil's footsteps. The burns in the snow. Fire. I scrambled for my backpack, pulling out a small bottle of lighter fluid and a box of matches. My hands shook as I doused a fallen branch and struck a match, the flame flickering weakly in the wind. As soon as the fire roared to life, the figures recoiled, their screams piercing the night. I made it back to the RV just before dawn, my body shaking with adrenaline and cold. The drifter's voice echoed in my mind, his laughter a cruel reminder of how close I'd come to losing everything. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw them. Hoof-shaped burns etched into the roof of my RV, smoldering faintly against the snow. I never wrote the article. Some stories are better left untold, but even now, I can't escape the dreams. The red glow, the whispers, and the drifter's smiling face. Whatever Burrow Flats took from me, it's not done yet. My name is Emma Richards. I'm 28, a nurse from Pittsburgh, and this story happened last Christmas. I've always been practical, grounded in reality, but what I experienced in the Hollow Creek Trail in Allegheny National Forest changed everything I thought I knew about the world. I'm not sure if I'll ever feel safe again. It started innocently enough. My best friend Mia had convinced me to go camping. "It'll be fun," she'd said, her enthusiasm contagious. Mia was 29, bold, adventurous, and a magnet for trouble. She'd been dating Ethan, a cautious, quiet accountant in his 30s. He only agreed to join us because Mia begged him. Her younger brother Tyler, 22, rounded out our group, a sarcastic tech geek who spent more time staring at his phone than the world around him. The plan was simple. Drive Ethan's RV out to Hollow Creek for a spooky Christmas adventure. The trail was rumored to be haunted by Native American legends, stories about skinwalkers and spirits. I didn't believe in any of it, but I wanted a break from hospital shifts and holiday stress. A snowy forest seemed like the perfect escape. We left early on Christmas Eve, the RV packed with food, blankets, and enough camping gear to survive a week. The Allegheny National Forest was breathtaking, its towering pines blanketed in snow. Tyler complained most of the drive, grumbling about the lack of cell service. Mia ignored him, giddy about the ghost stories she'd read online. By late afternoon, we found a secluded spot near Hollow Creek, miles from the nearest marked trail. It was perfect. Silent except for the crunch of snow underfoot and the occasional rustling of wind through the trees. But as we stepped out of the RV to set up camp, an unsettling quiet fell over the forest. No birds, no animals, not even the sound of wind. I remember shivering, and not just from the cold. "Maybe the animals are hibernating," Ethan suggested as we unpacked. Mia laughed, brushing it off. As we explored, I spotted strange tracks in the snow, a set of large, canine-like footprints that abruptly shifted to something resembling human feet. My stomach churned, but I didn't say anything. I didn't want to sound paranoid. That night, we built a fire and sat around it, telling stories. Mia recounted the legend of the skinwalkers, witches who could transform into animals and mimic human voices. Tyler rolled his eyes, calling it nonsense. "It's just a creepy bedtime story," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. But as the fire crackled and the darkness deepened, I began to feel watched. Shapes seemed to shift in the shadows, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Then we heard it, a faint laugh, soft, distant, but unmistakably human. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. "Probably another camper," Mia said, though there was a nervous edge to her voice. But I knew better. We hadn't seen a single soul all day. The next morning, we decided to hike further into the woods. The GPS was acting up, and Ethan grumbled about bad directions. Tyler's phone was dead, much to his frustration, but Mia seemed thrilled by the sense of isolation. We found it around noon, a strange wooden totem carved with intricate symbols half buried in the snow. It looked ancient, weathered by time, but the carvings were sharp and deliberate. "What do you think it is?" Mia asked, kneeling to examine it. "Maybe some kind of marker?" Ethan guessed, though he didn't sound convinced. As we stared, the forest seemed to darken. Ethan reached out, brushing his fingers against the totem's surface. He froze, his eyes widening. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Hear what?" I said, my pulse quickening. "Whispers," Ethan muttered, shaking his head as if to clear it. It was talking to me." That night, the tension among us was palpable. The fire burned low, and the forest seemed to close in around us. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Then it happened. Mia screamed, clutching her leg. Blood seeped through her jeans, and when we pulled them up we saw deep gashes, as if something had clawed her. But there was nothing there. No tracks, no sign of an animal. "We need to leave," Ethan said, panic creeping into his voice. "Leave? It's probably just a wild animal," Mia argued, wincing in pain. But even she didn't sound sure. The next few hours were a blur of fear and confusion. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows across the snow. We heard voices, our voices, echoing through the forest, calling to us. "Emma?" a voice whispered, eerily similar to my own. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. Tyler laughed nervously, dismissing it as the wind. But then we saw it. A tall, emaciated figure standing just beyond the firelight. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its limbs were impossibly long. It looked almost human, but its movements were wrong, jerky, unnatural. Mia gasped, clutching my arm. "What is that?" "A skinwalker," Ethan whispered, his face pale. The creature began circling our campsite, staying just out of reach. It mimicked our voices, calling out from different directions. "Help me!" it cried, using Mia's voice. Then Tyler's. Then mine. Panic set in. Tyler grabbed a stick, lighting it in the fire to use as a torch. "Stay together," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The skinwalker lunged, its claw-like fingers raking against the RV as we scrambled inside. Ethan slammed the door shut, and we huddled together, listening to the creature scratch and howl outside. "We have to fight back," Mia said, clutching a silver trinket she'd brought for luck. Silver. The word clicked in my mind. "Give me that," I said, grabbing the trinket. "Maybe it'll work." The next morning, as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we made our move. We lit a massive bonfire, hoping to drive the creature back. It screeched, its distorted body writhing in the shadows. Mia hurled the silver trinket at it, and the skinwalker recoiled, letting out an inhuman shriek. The air grew still, and the creature vanished into the forest. We didn't wait to see if it would return. We drove out of Hollow Creek as fast as the RV could go, silent except for the sound of our ragged breathing. Mia needed stitches, and Ethan refused to speak to her for days. Tyler deleted all his social media accounts, muttering something about being watched. As for me, I can't sleep without hearing that voice, my own voice, whispering from the darkness. I don't know what we encountered in Hollow Creek. Maybe it was a skinwalker. Maybe it was something worse. All I know is this: I'll never go camping again. My name is Daniel Harris, and I was 29 when I spent Christmas Eve alone in Pisa National Forest. I'm not someone you'd call an adventurer. I grew up in Charlotte, surrounded by the hum of city life, and my idea of wilderness was the overgrown lot behind our apartment complex. But last year, when my girlfriend left and the holidays loomed like a bad joke, I needed an escape. I told myself a winter camping trip would clear my head, give me purpose. Instead, it gave me something I'll never forget, and wish I could. It was late December when I packed my secondhand gear into my SUV and drove up to the Blue Ridge Mountains. The snow had fallen early that year, blanketing the forest in white. The roads were icy, and the sky was bruised with low clouds. But I felt a kind of reckless determination. Pisa was calling, and I had to answer. I planned to spend 2 nights, photograph the frozen trails, and return in time to toast a lonely glass of whiskey in my apartment on Christmas night. The gear I brought, I realize now, was laughably inadequate. A cheap nylon tent, a sleeping bag rated for fall weather, and a camp stove I hadn't tested. But I didn't care. I wanted isolation, and I found it. I set up camp on a ridge overlooking a shallow valley, the trees below bare skeletons in the snow. The first day went smoothly enough. I hiked, snapped pictures of icicles hanging like crystal daggers, and watched the sun sink behind the hills. But as night fell, the forest changed. It became something alive, restless. The kind of quiet that presses against your skull until you swear you can hear your own blood. That night, I woke up shivering. My sleeping bag, though zipped tightly around me, offered little warmth against the biting cold. The cheap tent flapped violently in the wind, and I could hear snow pattering against the fabric like tiny claws. I tried to sleep, but my teeth chattered too hard, and then I heard it. A whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it again, clearer this time, cutting through the gusts. Daniel. My name, spoken in a soft, sing-song voice that sent ice down my spine. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. Nothing. Just the wind sighing through the trees. "Don't lose it," I muttered to myself, convincing myself it was a trick of my tired brain. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I found footprints in the snow. They circled my campsite, perfect impressions of bare feet, the toes splayed wide, almost human but not quite. My stomach tightened as I crouched to examine them. They weren't mine, and I was the only camper for miles. I wanted to pack up and leave, but pride kept me there. I refused to let a few eerie noises and footprints scare me off. I spent the day hiking deeper into the forest, photographing frost-covered ferns and the way the light broke through the snow-heavy branches. It was beautiful, but the beauty felt wrong, like a mask. Around mid-afternoon, the clouds darkened and the wind picked up. A storm was coming. I decided to head back, but that's when I saw it. The cabin. It stood a little off the trail, barely visible through the trees. The roof sagged under the weight of snow, and the windows were black, lifeless. I hadn't seen it on any map, but there it was, unmistakably real. Against my better judgment, I approached. The door creaked as I pushed it open. The inside was dark, the air stale and heavy. A rusted stove sat in one corner, and a wooden table stood in the center, its surface covered in dust. But what caught my eye were the photographs. Dozens of them, scattered across the table and pinned to the walls. They were old, sepia-toned, and they all featured the same man, a man who looked unsettlingly like me. I picked up one of the pictures and felt a chill. The man in the photo stood in a forest clearing, his face gaunt, his eyes wide and hollow. He wore clothes that could have been from the early 1900s, but the resemblance was uncanny. Beneath the photo was a scribbled note. He never left. I didn't linger. I ran back to camp, the snow falling harder now, my breath clouding in the icy air. By the time I reached my tent, the storm was in full swing and darkness had fallen. I huddled inside, trying to warm my hands with the sputtering stove, but my mind raced. Who was that man? Why did he look like me? That night, the whispers returned. Louder, insistent. They seemed to come from every direction at once, surrounding the tent. And then I heard something else. A low, guttural growl, followed by the sound of snow crunching underfoot. My heart seized. Something was out there. Grabbing my flashlight, I unzipped the tent just enough to peer outside. The beam of light cut through the snowstorm, illuminating the trees. At first, I saw nothing, but then it stepped into view. It was tall, its body gaunt and twisted, like a man stretched on a rack. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes glowed a sickly yellow. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The thing tilted its head and then it smiled, its mouth splitting wider than any human mouth should. I ducked back into the tent and zipped it shut, as if that thin layer of nylon could protect me. The whispers grew louder, the growl deeper, and then, in a voice that sounded eerily like mine, it spoke. "Daniel, come out." I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed with fear. At some point, the whispers faded and the growling stopped. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, waiting. At dawn, I decided to leave. Screw the photographs, screw the pride. My only goal was to get out alive. I packed my gear in a frenzy, my hands shaking so badly I could barely tie the straps. As I trudged through the snow, I heard footsteps behind me. Turning, I saw her. She was a woman, dressed in a ranger's uniform, her auburn hair tied back in a braid. She looked out of place, almost spectral, but her voice was steady. "You need to leave," she said. "No kidding," I stammered. "What the hell is out here?" Her eyes darkened. "It's a skinwalker. It knows you're afraid, and it'll use that fear to draw you in. You can't fight it, not in the way you think." "What do I do?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. She glanced over her shoulder, as if expecting the creature to appear at any moment. "Fire. It can't stand fire. But you'll have to trick it first, make it show itself fully. It won't be easy." And then, before I could ask more, she turned and walked into the woods, disappearing like a wisp of smoke. The creature found me again that night. I had built a small fire, its warmth doing little to calm my nerves. I sat clutching a makeshift torch, listening to the whispers grow closer. The thing stepped into the firelight, its twisted body casting long, spindly shadows. It spoke again, this time in the woman's voice. "Daniel, it's safe now. Come with me." "No," I said, my voice trembling but firm. "Show me what you really are." The creature paused, its head tilting in mock curiosity. Then, slowly, it stepped closer, its form shifting and contorting until it was fully visible in the firelight. Its skin bubbled and cracked, its limbs elongating unnaturally. Its smile widened, revealing rows of jagged teeth. I lunged forward and thrust the torch at it. The flames licked its pale skin, and it let out an unearthly scream. The sound was like nails on glass, piercing and unbearable. The creature stumbled back, its body writhing as the fire consumed it. The flames spread to the surrounding brush, and I ran, the forest behind me ablaze. When I finally reached the trailhead, exhausted and half frozen, I looked back. The fire had died down, and the forest was eerily quiet. I never saw the woman again, and when I asked the rangers about her, they had no record of anyone matching her description. The photographs I took on that trip? They were mostly ruined, overexposed from the heat of the fire. But one survived. It shows a figure standing just beyond the tree line, its yellow eyes glinting in the shadows. I keep it as a reminder to never go back. Pisa called to me once. It will never call again. My name is Jason Reed, and I'm 41 years old. Last Christmas Eve, I took my RV out to the Mogollon Rim in Coconino National Forest, Arizona. I was hoping to spend the holiday alone, away from the world, photographing wildlife in the snow. That's what I told myself, at least. The truth is, I couldn't face another Christmas without Ella, my little girl. She would have been 9 last year if she hadn't gotten sick. Camping was my escape. Out in the wild, surrounded by nothing but trees and sky, I could pretend life was simple again. But that trip, I'm not sure I'll ever be the same after what happened. I arrived at the trailhead late in the afternoon. The Mogollon Rim was stunning under the winter sun. Towering pines draped in snow, the cliffs dusted white like powdered sugar. The cold air burned my lungs as I stepped out of the RV, but I welcomed it. Pain meant I was still here, still moving forward. I spent the first hour scouting the area for good photo opportunities. The snow was untouched, and I caught sight of a few deer in the distance, their coats blending with the trees. The peace was exactly what I needed, until the giggling started. It was faint, carried on the wind, but unmistakable. Children's laughter, high-pitched and playful. I froze, my camera halfway to my eye. I hadn't seen any cars at the trailhead, and I was miles from the nearest town. I scanned the tree line, but there was nothing there, just snow and shadows. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing back at me. The giggling stopped. I told myself it must have been the wind, a trick of the forest. But as I turned back toward the RV, I noticed something I hadn't before. Small footprints in the snow circling where I stood. They were fresh, impossibly fresh, and far too small to belong to an adult. That night, I tried to shake off the unease. The RV was warm, and I had a thermos of hot coffee and a book to keep me company. But the silence outside felt heavy, oppressive. No wind, no rustling branches, not even the call of an owl. Just stillness. I was halfway through my book when I heard it again, the giggling. Louder this time, closer. My stomach clenched. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped outside, the cold biting into my face. The beam swept across the snow, and there they were again. Footprints, dozens of them, scattered around the RV like a swarm. "Who's out there?" I called, my breath fogging in the air. A figure darted between the trees, just at the edge of the light. It was small, child-sized, moving too fast to be real. My chest tightened as a memory surged forward. Ella, running through the yard, her laugh ringing like a bell. "Wait!" I shouted, taking a step toward the trees. The figure stopped. Slowly, it turned to face me. My flashlight caught its outline. A little boy in old-fashioned clothes, his face pale and blank, his eyes too dark. He raised a hand and beckoned me once, before vanishing into the shadows. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the giggling, the crunch of footsteps in the snow. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of her. Ella, standing in the forest, wearing her favorite yellow dress. She was smiling, but her eyes, those weren't her eyes. They were dark, endless, like the boy's. In the dream, a woman appeared behind her. She was older, draped in a tattered white shawl, her face lined with sorrow. "Don't follow them," she said, her voice echoing in my mind. "They'll take you too." I woke with a start, my heart pounding. The RV was freezing, the heater inexplicably off. Outside, the giggling had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. The next morning, I found the footprints again. They led away from the RV, deeper into the forest, toward the cliffs. I should have ignored them, packed up and left. But something pulled me forward, a nagging feeling, a thread of hope that maybe, somehow, I'd find Ella, or at least a piece of her. The trail was slippery with ice, the air sharp and cold. The footprints grew more erratic, crisscrossing each other like a child's game. Then I saw it. A clearing up ahead, filled with strange shapes. When I stepped into the clearing, my breath caught. It was a playground. Old, rusted swings hanging limply, a broken seesaw half buried in the snow. The air felt thick, charged, like the moment before a storm. In the center of it all stood the boy, his back to me. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. He turned, and this time he wasn't alone. More children emerged from the shadows. 5, maybe 6 of them. All silent, all watching me with those dark, empty eyes. They gestured toward the edge of the clearing, where a faint path led to the cliffs. "Do you want me to follow?" I asked. They didn't answer, only nodded in unison. My legs felt like lead as I took a step forward, then another. The children moved with me, their footsteps soundless despite the snow. The path ended at the edge of a cliff, the forest falling away to a sheer drop below. The children surrounded me, their faces blank, their gestures more insistent. I looked down and saw what they wanted, a jagged rock outcrop jutting from the cliff face where a small, yellow ribbon fluttered in the wind. Ella's ribbon. My heart wrenched. "Ella?" I whispered. Behind me, the air shifted. I turned and saw her, standing among the children. She looked exactly as she had in life, small and perfect, her hair curling around her face, but her eyes, they weren't hers. "Daddy," she said, her voice soft and pleading. "Come with me." Tears blurred my vision. My foot slipped on the icy ground, and I nearly tumbled forward. Then I remembered the woman from my dream. Her warning like a lifeline in the chaos. "This isn't real," I said, my voice breaking. "You're not real." Ella's smile faltered, and the children's blank expressions twisted into something darker. Their eyes burned, black and bottomless, as they closed in around me. The world spun, and for a moment I felt myself falling, not just from the cliff but into something endless, suffocating. A sharp voice broke through the haze. "Run!" The woman from my dream stood at the edge of the clearing, her white shawl billowing in the wind. Her outstretched hand glowed faintly, casting the children in shadow. They shrieked, their forms flickering like a dying flame. And then they were gone. I stumbled back toward the clearing, collapsing onto the frozen ground. The woman knelt beside me, her touch warm despite the cold. "They wanted you to join them," she said, her voice heavy with sadness. "They're trapped here between life and death, and they need someone to take their place." "Ella," I choked out. Was that really her?" The woman shook her head. "No, but they knew your pain and they used it." By the time I made it back to the RV, the sun was rising. The forest felt empty again, as if the children had never been there. But I knew better. As I packed up and drove away, I caught one last glimpse in the rearview mirror. A small figure standing among the trees, her yellow ribbon fluttering in the breeze. I'll never forget what I saw that night, or the children who tried to take me. But I left the Mogollon Rim with something I hadn't expected, a sense of peace. Ella was gone, truly gone, and I knew now that chasing her memory wouldn't bring her back. Some ghosts, it seems, are better left behind. My name is Sarah Lopez, and I was 34 when I learned some places should be left alone. It was 2 days before Christmas, and I was parked at Braley Pond in Virginia, a remote spot in the George Washington National Forest. I was there alone in my RV, telling myself this trip was about independence, proving I could enjoy the holidays on my own terms. Truthfully, it was more about running, from a messy divorce, a career that felt stagnant, and the uncomfortable silence of an empty apartment. The forest was beautiful, especially in winter. Snow dusted the evergreens, and the pond was like glass, reflecting the overcast sky. But even in the daylight, Braley Pond had a strange stillness, like the world was holding its breath. I chalked it up to being so far from civilization, though part of me liked the idea that the place was haunted. The pond had a reputation for it, after all. That was part of the reason I'd chosen it. I thought the eerie backstory might inspire me for a blog post or even a short story. I should have left it at that. The first day was uneventful. I parked the RV in a clearing near the pond, set up a little campfire, and wrote for a few hours while the snow fell in soft flurries. It was peaceful, if cold. By sunset, a thick fog started to roll in, making the water seem to vanish into nothing. That's when I met Evan. He came out of the woods waving cheerfully, his red jacket standing out against the white landscape. At first, I was annoyed. I'd come here for solitude, and the last thing I wanted was company. But he seemed harmless, even friendly, so I waved him over. "You're braver than most," he said, grinning as he warmed his hands by my fire. "Not many people camp here anymore." "Why's that?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "You haven't heard?" He raised an eyebrow, clearly delighted by the chance to tell the story. "Brayley Pond is haunted. They say a murder-suicide happened here back in the 70s. A young couple. People still see them sometimes, usually around Christmas." "Convenient timing," I said with a smirk. "Let me guess. They're looking for closure?" "Something like that," he said, his grin fading. "But it's not just the couple, there's something else. They call her the Drowned. Some folks think she's tied to a silver locket. Whoever finds it is cursed until they return it to the water." I laughed it off, but the way his face darkened as he told the story stuck with me. He stayed for a little while longer, chatting about his amateur ghost hunting hobby before heading back to his own camp deeper in the woods. Alone again, I tried to shake off the unease his story had left behind. The first sign that something wasn't right came the next morning. I'd decided to hike one of the trails looping around the pond. It was cold, but clear. The fog from the night before mostly lifted. About halfway through the hike, I noticed something shiny in the mud near the water's edge. A silver locket. It was old, tarnished, and slightly bent. Inside was a black and white photo of a couple, their faces blurred by water damage. My stomach turned as I remembered Evan's story. The Drowned. The cursed locket. For a moment, I considered tossing it back into the pond, but then I felt foolish. It was just a coincidence, a piece of junk someone had lost years ago. I slipped it into my pocket, planning to write about it later. That night, the fog returned, thicker than before. I could barely see the outline of the trees beyond my RV windows. I tried to read, but the silence pressed in, heavy and oppressive. Then, just as I was about to call it a night, I heard it. Laughter. Faint, distant, and unmistakably human. I froze, my heart pounding. I told myself it was Evan, maybe drunk or joking around with someone. But when I stepped outside to look, the laughter stopped, and the woods were empty. Then I saw the footprints. Wet, bare footprints leading from the pond to the door of my RV. I backed inside, locking the door behind me. My mind raced. Could Evan have been playing a prank? Or was someone else out there, someone not so harmless? I didn't sleep much that night, jumping at every creak and gust of wind. The next morning, I went back to the pond. I told myself I was just clearing my head, but part of me wanted answers. The footprints were gone, but the air felt wrong, heavy with dampness despite the crisp winter chill. As I stood at the water's edge, I thought I saw something move beneath the surface, a shadow, long and serpentine. I took a step back. "Sarah." I spun around, but no one was there. The voice had been soft, almost a whisper, but clear as day, my name. Spoken by someone or something I couldn't see. By the time I returned to my RV, my nerves were shot. That's when Evan showed up again. His usual cheerful demeanor replaced by a nervous energy. He asked if I'd seen anything strange, and when I told him about the locket, his face went pale. "You have to get rid of it," he said. "But not just anywhere. It has to go back to the center of the pond." "Why?" I demanded. "What's the big deal?" He hesitated, then told me the rest of the story. He'd found the locket years ago and kept it as a curiosity. But strange things started happening. Wet footprints in his apartment. Nightmares of drowning. shadowy figures at the edge of his vision. He eventually returned it to the pond, and the phenomena stopped. "You're making this up," I said, though the unease in my gut told me otherwise. "Do you really want to find out?" he shot back. That night, the haunting escalated. I woke to the sound of dripping water. Groggy, I reached for the flashlight by my bed. The beam revealed wet handprints streaked across the inside of the RV windows, smearing downward as if someone had tried to claw their way in. My breath hitched, and the flashlight shook in my hand. Then came the nightmares. In my dream, I was standing in the pond, the water rising around my legs, then my waist, then my chest. Hands, cold and skeletal, reached up from the murky depths, pulling me down. I woke gasping, the smell of algae and damp earth clinging to my nostrils. I knew then that I couldn't stay another night, but when I tried to start the RV, the battery was dead. Panic set in. I grabbed the locket, stuffed it into my coat pocket, and marched toward the pond, Evan's warning echoing in my mind. The fog was so thick I could barely see a few feet ahead of me. The flashlight cut through it in jittery arcs as I stumbled to the water's edge. The pond was unnaturally still, the surface like black glass. I found a rowboat, half submerged near the shore, and dragged it into the water. As I paddled toward the center, the air grew colder, the fog heavier. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw her. She rose from the water slowly, her form impossibly thin, her hair a mass of writhing, black tendrils. Her eyes were hollow sockets, her face pale and bloated like something long drowned. She reached out, her fingers dripping with dark water, and the boat rocked violently. "Take it!" I screamed, throwing the locket into the water. It sank without a sound, swallowed by the black depths. But the figure didn't stop. Her hand closed around my wrist, icy and unyielding, pulling me toward the edge of the boat. "Please," I begged. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to disturb you." Her grip tightened, and I felt myself slipping. In desperation, I grabbed the flashlight and shone it directly at her face. The beam seemed to burn her, and she let out an ear-piercing wail, releasing me. The boat tipped, and I fell backward, splashing into the freezing water. I don't remember how I made it to shore. The next thing I knew, I was coughing and shivering on the bank, my clothes soaked and my body numb. The fog had lifted, and the pond was calm again, as if nothing had happened. I drove out of Braley Pond that morning, the RV's engine finally sputtering to life after what felt like an eternity of trying. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the forest far behind me. I've tried to forget what happened, but some nights, I still dream of the pond. I dream of her, and when I wake, there's always a faint smell of algae in the air. I haven't been back since, and I never will. Some places are best left alone. Braley Pond is one of them. My name is Kate Marlowe. I'm 32 years old, and this happened last Christmas Eve in the White Mountain National Forest in New Hampshire. I've always loved camping, especially in winter when the world feels quiet and untouched. That year, I decided to spend Christmas alone in my RV, parked near a trailhead I'd visited once before. I told myself it was about enjoying the solitude, but if I'm honest, I just didn't want to be around people. Christmas hasn't felt right for me since I lost my little brother Danny 5 years ago. The drive to the site was uneventful. The forest looked like a postcard. Tall evergreens weighed down with snow, the ground a pristine white carpet. My RV was stocked with supplies, and I had a solid plan. Camp overnight, do a short hike in the morning, and head back before the predicted snowstorm got too intense. Simple, easy, and exactly the kind of escape I needed. I reached the campsite around 3 p.m., just as the sun was beginning to dip. The air was sharp and cold, the kind that bites through layers if you're not moving. As I was unpacking, a park ranger appeared out of nowhere, his boots crunching through the snow. He was middle-aged, with a face that seemed carved from granite and a kind but wary look in his eyes. "Name's Eric," he said, extending a gloved hand. "You planning to camp here tonight?" I nodded. "Just the one night. I'll head back tomorrow before the storm." Eric frowned. "Storms coming in faster than expected. You should stay close to the main trail. These woods can get tricky in the snow, and we've had incidents." "What kind of incidents?" I asked, more curious than concerned. Eric hesitated, his eyes scanning the tree line. People wandering off, hearing things, seeing things. Some don't come back. It sounded like typical forest ghost stories to me, and I almost laughed. "I'll be careful," I said. "I've done this before." Eric didn't look convinced. "Suit yourself. But if you see anything strange, anything at all, get back to your RV. Don't go looking for it." He left with a warning to keep my radio on and my wits about me. I chalked up his cryptic words to local superstition and went back to setting up camp. Night fell quickly, as it does in winter, and the forest changed. The cheerful, snow-dusted landscape became dark and oppressive. My little campfire seemed absurdly small against the vastness of the woods. I sat near it, sipping hot chocolate and listening to the silence, which was absolute. No wind, no rustling branches, not even the distant hoot of an owl. It felt like the forest was holding its breath. I had just started to relax when I noticed them. Footprints in the snow, leading straight toward my camp. They were fresh, deep, and human, but I hadn't seen or heard anyone approach. My stomach knotted as I grabbed my flashlight and followed the prints with the beam. They stopped about 20 feet from my RV, as if whoever had made them had simply vanished. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding thin and uncertain. No answer. The forest seemed to press closer, the trees looming like silent witnesses. I shook off the unease, telling myself it was probably just an animal. I retreated into the RV, locking the door behind me. I woke around midnight to a sound that made my blood run cold. Footsteps crunching in the snow, circling the RV. I sat up in bed, holding my breath, listening. The steps were deliberate, heavy, too measured to be an animal. I grabbed my flashlight and peeked through the curtain. Nothing. The footsteps stopped. Then, a faint tapping on the window. "Hello?" A voice, soft and childlike, drifted through the stillness. I froze. It wasn't possible. The voice was unmistakably Danny's. My heart pounded as I opened the window a crack, the freezing air biting at my face. "Who's there?" I demanded. Silence. Then, just on the edge of my vision, I saw it. A shadowy figure standing among the trees, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. I slammed the window shut and locked it, my hands shaking. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching. Morning couldn't come fast enough. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, a combination of grief and the eerie isolation. I decided to take a short hike to clear my head before the storm rolled in. The forest seemed less menacing in the daylight, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. About half a mile from camp, I found another set of footprints. These were massive, humanoid but wrong, like something had stretched and distorted them. They weren't headed toward my camp, but deeper into the woods. Against my better judgment, I followed them. The trail led to a small clearing where the snow was undisturbed, except for a circle of deep, blackened marks as if the ground had been scorched. In the center lay a bundle of sticks arranged in the shape of a human figure. As I stared, the air grew colder. and I heard a faint whispering, too low to make out words. That's when I saw it again, the shadow figure now closer, its glowing eyes fixed on me. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, as if it were draining the heat and light from the world around it. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. "Kate!" The voice was unmistakable, and it came from the figure. "No!" I whispered, tears freezing on my cheeks. "You're not him." The figure tilted its head as if amused and stepped toward me. I finally found the strength to move and ran back to camp, not daring to look over my shoulder. Back at the RV, I radioed Eric. "There's something out here," I said, my voice shaking. "Something's following me." Eric's voice crackled back, calm but serious. "Stay in your RV, lock the doors, and don't respond to it. It's not human, it's the Shadow Walker." "What the hell is that?" I demanded. "A forest spirit. Demon, whatever you want to call it. It preys on people who are alone, feeds on their fear and grief. Don't let it in, Kate. No matter what it says or does, don't open the door." I barely had time to process his words before the RV shook violently, as if something heavy had slammed into it. I screamed and grabbed the nearest weapon, a cast-iron pan, and braced myself. The voice came again, louder this time. "Kate, please, it's me. Let me in." It wasn't just Danny's voice anymore. It was his face, pressed against the window, pale and desperate, but his eyes. They glowed like the Shadow Walkers. I clenched the pan tighter, my knuckles white. "You're not real," I said, my voice trembling. "You're not him." The thing outside let out a low, guttural laugh, then slammed into the RV again. I remembered what Eric said about not letting it in, but the longer I listened to its whispers, the harder it became to resist. It knew my guilt, my pain, and it was using them against me. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. It was hard to tell. The storm was in full force now, snow and wind battering the RV. The Shadow Walker had stopped its assault, but I knew it wasn't gone. It was waiting, biding its time. Desperate for a solution, I remembered the bundle of sticks in the clearing. Maybe it was connected to the thing stalking me. I grabbed a can of lighter fluid and my flashlight, steeling myself for one final confrontation. The clearing was almost invisible in the storm, but I found it, the stick figure still lying in the center. The whispering grew louder as I approached, the air thick with malice. I poured the lighter fluid over the sticks and lit a match. As the flames roared to life, the Shadow Walker appeared at the edge of the clearing, its silhouette writhing and distorting. It let out an unearthly scream, a sound that rattled my bones, and vanished into the storm. When I returned to the RV, the forest felt different. Quieter, less oppressive. I radioed Eric to tell him what happened. "You're lucky," he said. "Most people don't make it out." I didn't feel lucky, I felt hollow. The Shadow Walker was gone, but it had left a mark on me. I packed up and drove away as soon as the storm let up, vowing never to return to those woods. Some nights, when the world is quiet and I'm alone with my thoughts, I hear it again. Danny's voice calling from the shadows. My name is Mark Grayson, and I'm 28 years old. This happened on Christmas Eve, just last year, in the depths of the Ouachita National Forest, Arkansas. I never believed in ghosts or curses before this night, but I've come to understand that some places are best left undisturbed. Dylan, Lisa, Evelyn, and I planned a unique Christmas escape, a camping trip at a place called Widow's Peak. It was Dylan's idea, of course. At 27, Dylan was a thrill-seeker who thrived on adrenaline and urban legends. He had read about Widow's Peak on some paranormal blog and couldn't resist dragging us into it. Lisa, quiet and skeptical at 26, was reluctant, but Dylan had a way of convincing her. Evelyn, his 25-year-old girlfriend, usually followed his lead, though I could tell she wasn't thrilled about spending Christmas in a freezing forest. We arrived at the site late in the afternoon. The forest was blanketed in a thin layer of snow, the kind that muffles sound and makes everything feel too quiet. Widow's Peak stood like a looming silhouette in the distance, a craggy outcrop framed by skeletal trees. The place looked eerie even in daylight, but Dylan brushed it off, grinning like a kid on Christmas morning. "Let's set up camp," he said, unloading the RV. "We'll hike to the overlook tomorrow." I sighed and began helping. We should have packed better. Dylan, in his typical careless fashion, had insisted on packing light, leaving behind some of the gear I thought we'd need. I didn't like it, but I let it slide for the sake of the trip. By the time we lit the campfire, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the cold had seeped into my bones. Evelyn huddled close to Dylan for warmth, and Lisa sat cross-legged on a log, staring into the flames. "You know, they say the widow's ghost still haunts these woods," Dylan began, his voice low and dramatic. "She lost her husband and son in a blizzard right around Christmas, and now she searches for them, luring travelers into the forest." Lisa rolled her eyes. "That's just a story." "Is it?" Dylan smirked. "People have gone missing here. Maybe she thought they were her family. Or maybe they were just unprepared hikers," I muttered, poking at the fire with a stick. Evelyn shivered. "Let's talk about something else." We fell into an uneasy silence after that, the kind that made every creak of the trees feel louder. That was the first time I heard it, the faint sound of crying. It was distant, almost imperceptible, but enough to make me freeze. "Did you hear that?" I asked. "Hear what?" Dylan replied, distracted. I didn't push it. Maybe it was the wind. Later that night, as we settled into our tents, the crying returned. This time it was closer, weaving through the trees like a ghostly melody. I stepped out of my tent, flashlight in hand, and scanned the forest. The beam caught something hanging from a tree, a wreath made of bones. "Dylan!" I hissed. He stumbled out of his tent, followed by Evelyn and Lisa. I pointed to the wreath, and Lisa's face turned pale. "That's not funny, Dylan," she snapped. "Did you put that there?" He raised his hands defensively. "I swear I didn't." The crying grew louder, echoing all around us. Evelyn clutched Dylan's arm, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. "Mark, what is that?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But we're taking this down." I reached up and pulled the wreath from the tree. It was cold, unnaturally so, and the bones crumbled slightly under my grip. The crying stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. The next morning, we decided to hike to the overlook as planned, despite the eerie events of the night. Dylan was unusually quiet, and Evelyn seemed on edge. Lisa walked close to me, her eyes scanning the forest like she expected something to leap out at us. About halfway to the overlook, Evelyn screamed. We rushed to her side and found her pointing at a set of footprints in the snow. They were massive, human-like but distorted, as if the toes were elongated claws. They circled around our path before disappearing into the trees. "What the hell made those?" Lisa whispered. "No idea," I said, but my stomach churned. Something about this place felt wrong, like the forest was alive and watching us. Dylan laughed nervously. "Come on, it's probably just an animal." We pressed on, but the sense of being followed grew stronger with every step. Shadows moved at the edge of my vision, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. By the time we reached the overlook, the fog had rolled in thick and heavy, obscuring the view. Dylan wandered off to take pictures while Lisa, Evelyn, and I stayed close to the trail. The crying started again, louder this time and unmistakably human. "Dylan!" Lisa called out. "Where are you?" No response. Panic set in as we searched for him. His footprints led off the trail and into the fog, but they stopped abruptly, as if he had vanished into thin air. "Dylan!" Evelyn screamed, her voice cracking. Then we heard him, his voice calling from the trees. "Over here!" We followed the sound, but something felt off. His voice was distant and distorted, echoing unnaturally. When we reached the source, there was no sign of him, only his flashlight lying in the snow. Lisa grabbed my arm. "We need to go back. Now." As we stumbled back toward the campsite, the widow revealed herself. She appeared as a pale, grieving woman in a tattered dress, her hollow eyes fixed on us. Evelyn froze, her face a mask of terror. "Please," the widow whispered, her voice like a dying wind, "help me find them." Lisa screamed and bolted, dragging Evelyn with her. I stood frozen as the widow's form twisted, her face contorting into something skeletal and inhuman. She lunged at me and I ran. Back at the campsite, I found Lisa frantically carving symbols into the trees with a hunting knife. "It's a ward," she said, her hands trembling. "I read about it once. It might keep her out." The widow appeared at the edge of the clearing, her skeletal hand outstretched. Evelyn collapsed, frost forming on her skin where the widow had touched her. Desperate, I grabbed the gas canister from the RV and poured it in a circle around us. With a trembling hand, I lit the fire. The flames roared to life, forming a barrier between us and the widow. She screamed, a sound so piercing it felt like it would split my skull, and then she vanished into the fog. We left as soon as the sun rose, driving in silence. Dylan was never found, and Evelyn never recovered. She wakes up screaming most nights, claiming the widow is still with her. As for me, I've never set foot in a forest again. Some places are cursed, and Widow's Peak is one of them. My name is Mark Elliott, and I was 41 when I learned there are places where the land itself feels alive. This happened 2 days before Christmas, during a solo RV camping trip to the Devil's Playground, a remote stretch of eerie rock formations in the Utah desert. I'd recently lost my job as a geologist, downsized after years of service, and I figured this trip would help me clear my head and reconnect with my love of the natural world. The Devil's Playground, named for its bizarre, wind-carved rock formations, had fascinated me for years. I wanted to map the area, document its geology, and maybe turn my findings into a small project. It was remote, desolate, and perfect for solitude. Or so I thought. I arrived mid-afternoon on December 22nd. The sun was dipping low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the twisted rocks. The formations looked almost alive, their shapes strange and otherworldly, like frozen waves or giant claws reaching skyward. I parked my RV in a flat clearing at the base of the rocks and set up camp. The first evening passed without incident. The desert sky lit up with stars, and the air was bitterly cold. I spent hours staring at the formations, running my fingers over the sandstone, marveling at the patterns etched by centuries of wind. By the time I crawled into bed, I felt a rare sense of peace. I was alone with the desert, and that was exactly what I needed. But the peace didn't last. The first sign that something wasn't right came the next morning. I was hiking one of the trails, my GPS in hand, marking coordinates and taking notes. The terrain was challenging, jagged rocks, loose sand, but nothing I couldn't handle. After about an hour, I spotted a figure up ahead. It was a man, sitting on a boulder near the trailhead. He wore a faded jacket and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his face from the sun. As I approached, he waved. "Morning," he called, his voice calm but faintly amused. "Out here all alone, huh?" "Yep," I replied, trying not to sound as uneasy as I felt, "just doing some mapping." "You picked an interesting place for it," he said, his eyes glinting under the brim of his hat. "You know what they call this place?" "The Devil's Playground," I said, smiling faintly. "I'm guessing you're about to tell me why." He chuckled, the sound dry and hollow. "This land's got a way of messing with people. They see things, hear things. Sometimes they don't come back." I waited for him to laugh to let me know he was joking. He didn't. Instead, he stood, brushed the dust off his jacket, and pointed toward the rocks. "If you've got any sense, you'll head back before dark. These rocks don't like company." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. He gave me a small, knowing smile before turning and walking back toward the trailhead. When I looked down to check my GPS, it was dead. I shook it, pressed the buttons, but the screen remained blank. Annoyed, I decided to head back to my RV, marking the trail by memory. That night, the wind howled through the rocks, creating an eerie, low moan that sounded almost human. I wrapped myself in a blanket and tried to read, but the noise was relentless. Around midnight, I heard something else. Footsteps outside the RV. Slow, deliberate. I froze, my heart hammering. For a moment, I told myself it was just the wind, but the sound continued, circling the RV. I grabbed my flashlight and peered out the window, but the beam revealed only the empty desert. The footsteps stopped, and I managed to convince myself it was just an animal. But when I stepped outside the next morning, I found a single set of footprints in the sand, leading away from the RV toward the rocks. They were deep, as though made by a heavy boot, and they vanished abruptly about 20 yards from camp. Determined to shake off my unease, I set out again with my compass and a physical map. The GPS was still dead, and now my phone refused to turn on as well. I cursed my luck, but the rational part of my brain attributed the malfunctions to the cold. As I explored deeper into the playground, the sense of wrongness grew. Shadows seemed to shift in the corners of my vision, and the rocks took on strange, almost humanoid shapes. At one point, I found myself backtracking over the same stretch of trail I'd just walked, even though I was certain I'd gone straight. It was as if the terrain was folding in on itself, leading me in circles. Then I saw them. Figures moving among the rocks. They were distant, indistinct. At first, I thought they were other hikers. But as I watched, I realized they weren't walking. They were gliding, their movements fluid and unnatural. I called out, but they didn't respond. When I approached, they vanished, leaving no trace in the sand. By the time I made it back to my RV, the sun was setting, and the wind had picked up again. I locked the door and turned on every light I had, hoping to banish the growing sense of dread. But the lights flickered, and then the power went out entirely, plunging the RV into darkness. That's when I heard the voice. "Mark!" It was soft, almost a whisper, but it came from right outside the RV. My breath caught, and I stayed perfectly still, hoping it would go away. "Mark!" the voice said again, louder this time. It was my voice. I grabbed a flashlight and threw open the door, shining the beam into the night. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the light. It looked like me. Same build, same clothes. But its face was wrong. The features were blurred, like a poorly rendered image. It smiled, its teeth too sharp, and I slammed the door shut. The next few hours were a blur of terror. The thing outside circled the RV, whispering to me in my own voice. It replayed moments from my past, dredging up memories I'd tried to forget. It taunted me with the betrayal of an old friend, a colleague I'd thrown under the bus to save my own job. Did it feel good, Mark? It hissed. Did it feel like winning? I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing a flashlight and a notebook, I stormed out into the night, determined to confront whatever this was. The figure was waiting for me, its blurred face tilting as if in curiosity. "What do you want?" I demanded. It didn't answer. Instead, it raised a hand and pointed toward the rocks. The shadows around it seemed to writhe and pulse, beckoning me closer. I don't know why I followed it, but I did. The rocks loomed like sentinels, their shapes twisting in the moonlight. The figure led me deeper into the playground until I was completely disoriented. The air felt heavier, colder, and the wind seemed to whisper my name. Then the figure stopped. It turned to face me, its form shifting and contorting until it no longer resembled me at all. It was tall, impossibly thin. Its limbs stretched like tree branches. Its face was a void, and its voice was a chorus of whispers. "Welcome to the playground," it said. The world around me began to warp. The rocks closed in, their shapes turning jagged and grotesque. The ground beneath me shifted, and I felt like I was falling, though my feet remained on solid ground. "You don't belong here," the voice continued, "but you will stay." I clutched my notebook, my hands trembling. Desperate to anchor myself, I began reciting geological facts aloud. The composition of sandstone, the process of erosion, anything to remind me of reality. The whispers grew louder, angry, but I kept going. Finally, the entity let out a guttural scream, and the world snapped back into place. The rocks were just rocks again, and the figure was gone. I stumbled back to my RV as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. The power was back on, and my equipment was functioning again. But when I opened my notebook, I found entries I didn't remember writing. Detailed maps of parts of the playground I'd never explored. I left that morning, vowing never to return. The Devil's Playground had shown me something I couldn't explain, something I didn't want to understand. Some places, I realized, are meant to be left alone.